Perfect? All right, good. I'm doing great. This is my first time at this conference, and I'm learning a lot. So it's a fabulous conference. So thanks to everyone who's helped put it on and everyone that supported it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about GraphQL and how to consume GraphQL with PowerShell. I guess a bit of a background in how this sort of came about with me is the company I work for, Rubrik, we've long had REST APIs with our product. And with the introduction of a central SaaS control plane, we've decided to migrate those to GraphQL APIs. So I worked on the DevRel team and supported, customers and partners consuming those REST APIs for years. And now all of a sudden, I've got this GraphQL thing shoved onto my plate, and I had to figure it out, and I had to figure it out fast. So really what today is going to be is sort of the path I've took, some of the tips and tricks that I've learned in terms of consuming GraphQL, and I hopefully, some of you guys can use it in your positions as well. How many people have consumed GraphQL APIs before? Okay, so 28% of the room, I would say. So that's good, because I do have some slides at the start to kind of explain, what GraphQL is, what a request looks like, how it compares to REST, and why it's better and why it's not better, and things like that. So first up, thanks to the sponsors. We're all pretty familiar with this slide by now, day 2. But without them, we wouldn't have a conference. So like I said, my name is Mike Preston. I work for a company called Rubrik in DevRel, now in tech marketing with them. My education was mainly through school, through college, to be a developer, focused mainly on Java. Got a job out of college, programming in Java, and quickly said, nope, not for me, and sort of muddied the waters and went into operations. But, that background's really helped me, and I'm sure as everyone here can, agree to, knowing how to program some things, develop things, automate things, it really helps you, especially in an automations role. My picture got a little messed up. I got an American flag there. So I have one more thing. I enjoy hockey and maple syrup, so I'll let you guess where I'm from. It's not the US, it's their northern neighbors, Canada. So for today, what we're going to talk about, mainly what GraphQL is. We'll do a little comparison of GraphQL and REST, and then we'll look at querying and mutating, and it's mostly going to be demos and some different tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. So what is GraphQL? Well, it's basically a query language. It's strongly typed, so everything's defined, and it allows you to interact via APIs. And the big thing about it is it allows us to fetch exactly what we want through a single request. And when we get into some slides later, we'll sort of illustrate how that compares to REST. It's a single endpoint, so you no longer have to remember all of those different REST endpoints. Everything goes through a single endpoint, so your URI is always going to be quite commonly /API/GraphQL. And it was released by Facebook sometime around, 2015, I think, is when it actually got open source to come out. And essentially, they built it to solve some data transmission problems and different things that they had using REST APIs. So essentially, there's 2 different operations we'll talk about today. There's another one here called subscriptions, which is beyond what I've learned so far. It's kind of like a webhooks type thing, but essentially what we do is we read data and we write data. So reading data is through the use of queries, and writing data is through the use of mutations. And these are kind of a couple basic examples, and it looks pretty easy so far. So essentially, if we want to read data, we run a query. If we want to write data, we run a mutation. So for a full request to kind of explain what goes into that, we obviously have our operation. So we've covered that. We're good so far. We name our operation. That's not required, but it's best practice to name something that you're trying to do. We then have our variable definition. So we got to define, what's going to be in there. So it's strongly typed. So in this case, we have a book name, and that's of type name filter. Name filter would then be further described in the schema of the GraphQL API to say it's, like a string or something like that. Then we have our query name or our mutation name. We pass in our arguments. We get some fields back. and then a variable dictionary to specify what data we want to send in to that, that query. And this will make a lot more sense when we kind of lay it out like this, because essentially all GraphQL is an HTTP request. So if you're familiar with REST and HTTP requests, you'll be familiar with all of the same stuff. So essentially, we just take our big query, take our big mutation, we cram that into the body, so the query and the variables. It's always a post method, so we always send a post request. And then, of course, we get some data back. So here's my 2 books, one about working with YOP. I worked with YOP. I know a lot of people know YOP, so I worked with YOP for a number of years, and I have some great stories that I think I could fill a book up with. And then another about how to make maple syrup. So essentially, we get a response, a JSON-like response. So to put it into perspective, you know, what's some of the benefits or some of the problems with REST? What can GraphQL solve? And the first one's going to be something called overfetching. So with REST, you know, we get the full payload all the time. So for this example, you know, say we just want to get a book, its ID, the name of the book, and the genre. So we'd send a REST request to the get API books endpoint, and then we get all this information back. So all of a sudden, I can see a problem. We're getting a ton of information back. And when you think about sending thousands of requests to get thousands of objects with thousands of properties, and then, you know, multiplying that by however many requests we send, there's going to be a lot of data going back and forth between that REST endpoint and your client. With GraphQL, we basically just define our query, and we tell it exactly what we want. So we want the ID, the title, and the genre of the book, and we just get that information back. So we can really specify exactly what we want with GraphQL and not have to filter through all that data when we get the return response. The second problem I've seen is REST requires multiple requests to get various bits of information. So for an example here, if we want to get a book and the author, you know, with REST, we're going to send a request to the books endpoint. We're going to get all that information back. We're then going to go ahead, find the author ID, and then send that to another endpoint, and of course, get all that information back. So we've sent 2 requests. We've got a bunch of information that maybe we don't need. With GraphQL, we can combine all of this together since it's somewhat related within the GraphQL schema behind the scenes. So we can say, give me my ID, my title, my genre, and then we can go ahead and say, you know what, give me the author's first name and last name as well. And bing, bang, boom, we get everything back that we've asked for. So there's a couple, that's the sort of the biggest problems that GraphQL solves in compared with REST. I don't have a slide for the downfalls, but one of the biggest ones I would say is query complexity, discovering how to create these queries, what fields are available, things like that. And it's just, it's different. It's not what we're used to. We're all used to consuming REST APIs, and we've got that down now. But once you get a sort of a handle on it, things start to make a little more sense. So how do we, you know, do this stuff with PowerShell? It's pretty simple. We use those same 2 commandlets that we always have to perform HTTP requests. So that's all I got for slides. So I'm just going to go through some code now, and hopefully this will help some of you out. And by all means, if you have questions, you can. We don't have to wait to the end. We can just shout them out. Okay. So first up, I guess, before I jump into the code, I should say, if you're looking for some public sample APIs to use, this repository here has an exhaustive list of pretty much every public GraphQL API that's out there. There's even some fun ones. I think there's Rick and Morty or something like that down in here. I saw some Star Wars stuff up there. So there's lots of things you can do here to play out. And a lot of them have, you know, there's Rick and Morty. You can go ahead and you can actually, you know, try them out within the Apollo client or the GraphiQL interface. Okay. Is that big enough? Good? All right. Okay, so let's start querying some stuff. So the first thing we're going to do here is just define our query. So I should explain, I'm using the SpaceX API for this. So there's a test SpaceX API that you can use. And here I'm basically running the launches query, and I'm asking for ID, mission name, and details. We then sort of cram that into a body variable to send along, and then we have all of our params for invoke web request. So I forgot the actual to print it to screen. So we can see there already we've gone ahead, we've sent that request through, and we've got some information back from the SpaceX API. So that's a pretty simple query. In order to pass arguments, again, it's pretty easy. I defined the limit argument on this, and I'm going to go ahead and cram that into the query, ask for that same information, do the exact same stuff, and this time we should only get 1 back, right? So that kind of makes sense, but not too often are we going to hard code a limit into the actual code. We're going to probably get that from somewhere else. So again, just like the example, what we'll do is we'll actually define it in the query in the argument definition here, and we'll just run the same thing to get that information. I'm going to use my laptop because I think it's much easier. So that's essentially the same query. It's just instead of actually hard coding the one, we're hard coding it into this variable dictionary as well, which is going into the hash table that's going into the body. So that's how we're specifying that. So a better practice would be actually probably have this equal to like $limit or however we're getting that information. So these are pretty simple, but as it says here, it gets a little messy when you start using it against real-world APIs because quite often our queries aren't going to be requesting 3 things. We're going to be going through and requesting a whole bunch of stuff like this here. And that can get real messy real quick when you have giant query strings defined within your code. So quite often, what we'll do instead of that, to keep it somewhat clean, is to define your queries in an external folder and then import them that way. So in this case, we can see I'm just importing this launches.gql. So if we go look at that, it's the exact same stuff, except it's external to our actual script. So that helps you clean up your scripts a little bit in terms of keeping them nice and neat and tidy. And then as well, if you want to reuse this query anywhere else, you want more fields or anything like that, you can go ahead and just add them here, and then that flows throughout whatever application or automation that you're building. So in this case, we'll just grab that content. Let me get rid of this. We'll grab that content. I'll go ahead and strip all the new lines and leading and trailing white space from it, and go ahead and just stick that into the variable or into the body again and request a little bit more information this time. And the SpaceX API is pretty cool. It creates like a bunch of YouTube links to all the launches and everything if you want to play around with finding different launches of different rockets. But so even better yet, obviously take all of this code that I'm writing and stick it into a function. So we could see in this case, I have a function built called runGQL. There is one new thing here, a return filter, because quite often we're always going to see your response encompassed in something like objects or like data. So this function actually just runs the exact same code, except at the end, it's going to strip and pull that out of the return, apply that to the return, so we're not going to see that data stanza. So I'll get that function in there. My return filter here is going to be data, so we're not going to see that big encompassing data. And we run this, and now we get just the data we're looking for, which is the actual launches. So we can go even better than that, because if you look at what's getting returned, in order to access that, we're going to have to go to and print out response.launches. Maybe we want the data right up within the top level of that response variable. So this is just the same function again, but instead of using that return filter, what I've done is use something called aliasing. So within our queries, we can actually alias the return. So if we look at the launches with the alias query, it's the same query that we had before, except this time we have this little my alias and a colon in front of the query name. So what this does is, instead of returning data as the top level JSON object, it's going to return my alias, basically the text my alias. And this is really handy if you have multiple queries and you have one function that's parsing all of them. Maybe you want to call this something.objects or something like that. It'll always return, no matter what query you run, the same top level response, so you can easily filter that. So we'll just run this same query again. So at this point, you now see that we're returning basically just the actual data we're looking for. We're not having to drill into any of the information. So that part probably seems fairly simple to everyone. Everyone's probably pretty seasoned with running invoke web request and things like that. But really, the next sort of logical question is, so how do I know what fields are available within a GraphQL API? How can I take a look at that and discover what I can select? Because with REST, we know we just simply call the endpoint, we get everything back. With GraphQL, if we simply just call the endpoint without specifying any fields, actually I don't know what will happen, but I'm going to assume we'll get nothing back at all. So the first step would be use the documentation if it exists. Obviously, some APIs are very well documented. Some APIs, not so much. But something unique about GraphQL is it does have built-in introspection into its actual schema. So when I take a look here, I'm changing my params to pull in this introspection.queries query. So I can go ahead and have a look at that. I can actually run a query against the GraphQL schema to say, give me a list of all of the queries that are available that I can run. And you can go deep with this. That's probably going to be one of the hardest parts, is finding out, and I'll show you in a second, but when you run a query to get a list of the queries, how do I know what those queries are going to return? What's the return type? And sometimes it gets pretty buried into this schema. So sometimes it'll be name of type name. Sometimes you need to go even deeper, especially if it's returning an array of a certain type. You'll have to go even deeper because it'll say, hey, I'm returning an array. Well, an array of what? And you have to go one level deeper here and go, maybe you need to write of type again, and then go and grab it from there. So sometimes you have to go even deeper into your introspection. But essentially what this query does is queries the schema and brings in a list of all the queries available. So for this SpaceX API, we can run this and we can see it's returning a list of all the queries that are available. So we could say, there's a payload query, there's payloads, there's Roadster, there's Rocket, there's Rockets. So those are all queries that are available for us to run against this GraphQL API. You can even dig even deeper into that infrastructure or introspection and say things like, well, give me all the arguments as well that are available. So if a query requires a certain argument, obviously like the Rocket query is going to need the ID or the name of a rocket to return. But we'll take a look at this rockets rockets one and see what it returns. So I'll just filter that data that it returned and then print out the type.of type of the rocket, and we can see the rocket query returns a rocket. So now all you need to do is just put all the rocket fields in there. But the thing is, we don't know what fields are involved in a rocket object. So to get that information, you actually have to introspect further into a list of the types. So this is going to be another query here, and I'll be sure to upload all of this, but this is going to be another query here that we're going to introspect the schema again and then return all of the different types that it has. So we can have a look at that. And then within that, we're going to get the type name, obviously, which is hopefully going to be rocket. And then we'll get a list of all of the different fields within that as well. So there's a big list of all of our different types. We can see once we get up to some of the main ones. Here we go. We got, ship's results, ship mission. In here, we're going to see rocket as well somewhere. Here it is. So if we filter out on that return to actually see all of the different fields within rocket, we can see, okay, now we're starting to see some information here. We can get information like its boosters, its company, whether it's active or not. Excuse me, different things like that. So that's what GraphQL says. This is great. You can introspect the query. You could do it with code, and I'm sure that is great, but I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say, common or useful to me to have to do that every single time. So what I've done is use something called, now I don't know how you pronounce this, but for the GraphQL seasoned people in here, is it GraphiQL or is it GraphiQL? I've heard both. I like saying GraphiQL, it sounds better. But essentially, this is just a little program. It's free. You can, import or type in the API endpoint that you're connecting to. If it requires authentication, you can go ahead and add a bearer authentication into it as well. And what it does is kind of allow you to click through the schema and quickly find out things. So let me get back here. When we get into the schema, we can see we have our three objects. We have queries, mutations, subscriptions. So we could drill into query here, and we can easily see the rockets query. Drill into that. We can see it returns a type rockets or an array of rockets. And then we can easily see all the different fields. And you can even run the queries right in here if you want. So to sort of test different things. And it has autocomplete and all of that stuff. So we can say, give me there is no name. There is no ID. Okay. Let's just core, different things like that. Core is an actual object, it looks like. So we could do the ID there, and you can actually just run this query right directly within GraphiQL to sort of test out different things and use it that way. So that would be, one thing I would probably recommend using. It makes it really easy to discover all the different types and all the different information within the schema. Another thing is and I didn't have it up here, another thing is there is a module that someone has written to make everything really easy called PSGraphQL. So that's a module you can use. It's similar to that function that we had just written before, except it's way better and has way more functionality into it. But it's basically a function that allows you to pass headers, a URI, your query, and away you go. You can run GraphQL queries against an API. And the last thing I wanted to show you was sort of a project that I've been working on with someone at work. Actually, Jake Robinson, he used to be the PM, or he worked within the VMware Power CLI module. But we kind of had this idea of if we can introspect the GraphQL schema in code, why can't we just, connect to an endpoint and create a PowerShell module with all of the different queries based off of that schema? So it's available here. It's really in its sort of infant stages. It only run queries right now. It doesn't do mutations, things like that. But the idea is it has one commandlet, connect GraphQL API. We take in things like a name, because we need a name to name the actual module that it outputs, the URI or the GraphQL endpoint, the headers if you need to put some authentication in there, as well as a depth parameter, because I know with our GraphQL schema at Rubrik, you can really start going really deep, and you can get into this sort of infinite loop in terms of introspecting that schema. Because, for an example, there's a countries API that you can use. It's public, and that's kind of what spawned this depth parameter is. But when you get a country object in the country's GraphQL API, it returns the country, and then it returns the continent. And then when you go one level deeper inside the continent, it again returns the country, and within that country is a continent. So at some point in time, you have to stop, or things are just going to, flat out die on you. So basically, what this module does, connects to the endpoint, and it basically creates a dynamic module based off of all of the different information that you provided, and then creates commandlets to run each and every query. This code actually was, I don't know who did it, was a previous PSConf that I watched on YouTube to actually learn how to create these dynamic modules, and I thought it was pretty neat, so that's what we ended up using. But so to kind of show you how that works, we'll import the module, and then I'll set up these parameters. So basically, we're importing that SpaceX module, providing some headers saying, let's go 3 levels deep. And let's go ahead and run our connect commandlet. So what that does now is it goes through and it grabs all of the different queries. Looks like there's 37 of them there from the SpaceX module, and creates that dynamic module for us. So we can see all of a sudden we have different functions now, like get SpaceX ships, get SpaceX rockets, and different things like that. So if I run the get SpaceX launches and output that to verbose, it's going to go ahead and connect up and grab all that information for us. And as you can see, it's outputting, I hope that didn't go off the screen. It did. Anyways, let me do this quickly, or not this one. I guess I could have just hit up arrow. So you can see it's kind of outputting the query that it's running within that. So it's going 3 levels deep and getting as much information as it can. So the problem we had there was, well, we're kind of losing the benefits of GraphQL. Now all of a sudden we're just getting a whole bunch of information that we don't need. So what we did was we actually added the ability to create the dynamic parameters on the fly as well. So if we look at the help, you can see we can actually provide a list of properties to select as well. So in this case, we can say function give me, just these properties, the root ID, the video link. And then we actually have the arguments as well. We're going to limit it to 2. So then obviously this query is much smaller, and now we're only getting the information that we requested. And of course, the arguments are fully supported as well. So for the launch query within that API, it accepts an ID. So we can actually just, pass it the ID as well and just get that one single SpaceX launch. And here's just another example. We can go ahead and connect to this Barcelona transit public API, and it'll go through and go ahead and, I don't know why this is doing this for me, but it actually pulls in those two It's 10 queries from the Barcelona transit, and then we can go ahead and all of a sudden have commandlets to get the Barcelona bike stations. That sounds good. So you can go ahead and parse and get all of that. So the nice thing I found about this is every single time you run that connect commandlet, it's going to go ahead and parse that schema. So you're always going to have, if the schema changes, you're always going to have the latest up-to-date information from that. And I guess time permitting, I should say, there is a couple extensions that I do use. Obviously, the syntax highlighting for GraphQL, and then another one. Where'd it go? Oh, right here, the language support one, which provides the autocomplete and whatnot, and that's easily set up. Essentially, you just need a GraphQL config within your project folder, point it to the schema, and then you just need to go ahead and download the schema. There's lots of tools that you can use to do that. There's a Python one that I use mostly. I think it's called get GQL schema or something like that. To pull that in, and then you can do, you get all the nice autocomplete things within VS Code. So it'll go ahead and figure out basically give you all that sort of autocomplete stuff within there. So that is essentially what I had to show. I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions that anyone may have. So fire away if we have some. Yep. So the question was, is there a standardized way to do paging with large data sets? Yes, there is. Within GraphQL, a lot of times, not often with these public APIs that are simple and small, but a lot of times it'll return edges, and within the edges that it returns is a list of nodes, which is actually the data that you're looking for. Within there, it'll have cursors, and you can go ahead and take that cursor and fetch the next 10 and just keep going. Yeah, I don't have a standardized way in PowerShell, but again, that's a pretty simple thing to write, I would imagine. So, sure.
Is there a standardized way for error results from a process? Again, exactly where as REST APIs can get anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question was, what about error responses and standardized error responses? And that's a tough one because I've found with different GraphQL implementations, the way they respond back, sometimes you'll get a 200, like that everything's fine. There's nothing within that original data stanza, but then you get some messages, below that, returning things like internal server error and whatnot within that. So that's really, I would say, up to the API that you're connecting to, which is unfortunate at this point. But anything else? Was this useful? I don't know. Perfect. Well, thank you very much.